thanks to everybody who's here. We're competing with Bernie Sanders in the Bronx. So I think this is a great crowd. Thank you. And thanks to Gwyneth Malin, Alexandria Martinez, Daniela Valentin, Chris Alexander for hosting us tonight and making tonight's reception possible. My colleagues and students who heard me talk about shopping malls for years. And two special guests here tonight, Oriana Prieto, student at the Universidad of the Andes. I don't know if she's here now. She was here before. Hey, raise up, come on. Who helped with a lot of the logistics of research in Bogotá and is now a fellow at SEA writing her dissertation. And also Alejandro Aristizabal, también, hey. He's the organizer of the Kisaton, which is the largest demonstration at a shopping mall in Bogotá while I was doing my research, and he actually just got a dance fellowship and he's in New York City. So make sure that when you're in the reception, you introduce yourself to these celebrities. And also to Arjun and Julie, who agreed to comment on the book today. So I'm going to limit my comments to 5 minutes because I've asked both Arjun and Julie purposefully to share their thoughts based on my admiration for the work, and because I thought that they'll have something interesting to say about both the political economy of Latin America in the case of Julie, and Arjun in terms of globalization and consumption, and should I say or not? Your incredible love and fascination for narconovelas, which I felt would yield some appreciation to the book. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to limit my comments and just follow their lead, and then we'll have a couple of questions. But my goal is to keep the program purposefully short, and I've asked Gwyneth to mark an hour since I've spoken already, so we could just share and have a good wine and cheese and meet each other, which is purposefully what book parties should be. So for that, I'm going to rely on a PowerPoint presentation that will point to the main themes of the book, but I'm not really going to go into them. You'll have to read the book for that. Instead, what I'm going to do is just limit myself to a couple of comments. Now, why did I write this book? I grew up in Puerto Rico surrounded by malls. And doing research in Latin America, I was kind of surrounded by them and surprised that they were springing everywhere. When I was doing my research in Puerto Rico, in shopping mall consumption, I got access to the director of the International Council of Shopping Malls, which was then kind of opening up spaces and conferences in Latin America. He knew about my research and invited me to present my work in Puerto Rico in a conference in Medellin. And that's one of those kind of fortuitous, like, oh my God, here I have access. I'm in the belly of the beast. I have access to all these developers. I had to write this book. So it's not like I've always wanted to write a book of shopping malls. It's just that I found myself with the access and kind of in the middle of an industry, and I had to tell that story. What I learned is that the shopping malls are at the center of major debates and transformations. But I wanted to challenge in particularly a lot of the dominant but skewed assessments of this industry that were coming up a lot from developers, government officials, basically people on the street. First, what I try to do in the book is challenge the boosterism about shopping malls. A lot of the pundits and developers and governments celebrated their development, and we're talking about a rapid growth in the past 10 years. We have hundreds of malls that are transforming cities, and people are celebrating this development as signs of modernity. They're bringing public spaces. They're interpreted as symbols of democracy. One of the key elements is that these malls they've been developed in cities. So because they're developing cities with access to public transportation, a lot of observers believe that they're kind of more accessible and they're a sign of kind of democracy. And I felt like this was incomplete, that something funny was going on in terms of perhaps how North American observers had been interpreting race relations in Latin America, where a lot of observers were talking about the racial democracy in Latin America, observations based on comparing their putative, the racial democracy in Latin America with the United States. And I felt something similar was going on in terms of class relations and how people were observing class but not really understanding class inequalities and how class distinctions were being expressed in Latin America. Instead, people were celebrating these malls as kind of examples of intra-class mingling. And one of the things that I argue in the book is that this is not what's happening. That in fact, the shopping malls are becoming mediums for expressing social inequalities. Many of them are stratified, and they're developed as a medium of class stratification. Secondly, I also found a big trend in the literature on urban studies and urban planning and urban design, where Latin America, particularly cities like Bogotá, Medellin, have becoming examples of this kind of radical urbanism or pedagogical urbanism, where a lot of people are celebrating, oh, look, there's bike lanes. Look, there's like infrastructure in transportation. And there's a lot of kind of celebration for the kind of creative cities that a lot of, with many examples in Medellin and Colombia becoming examples. And I felt that that was really not really looking at how creative cities are occurring as part of larger neoliberal urban developments. And one of the interesting points that I argue in the book is how all these bike lanes and all these creative cities and parks, cement parks primarily, were being accompanied by the rise of shopping malls that nobody's looking at, that you have an incredible privatization of space that is occurring at the same time, and shopping malls are leading the mega development and what I call urban retail urbanism that nobody's really talking about. So I wanted to highlight that. And lastly, I also wanted to talk about debates around middle classes, because post the 2008 recession, a lot of Latin America societies became again subjects for celebrations for the rise of new middle classes. And I wanted to, my history of my work since Latinos Inc. onwards has always been to kind of go against the grain of all these kind of dominant scripts about consumption and public, and advertising. And to me, it was obvious that there was something more, that a lot of this description about emerging middle classes was more illusory than real. For instance, a lot of the consumption is fed by, for instance, the expansion of credit, which is really not sustainable, and also by new trade agreements that are opening up Colombia and Latin America for new imported cheaper goods, primarily from China and elsewhere, so that people are, if there's more consumption, it doesn't indicate a coming of age of these classes, or it's not a sign of economic well-being, but it's a sign of larger structural transformations that ultimately are not sustainable. So I wanted to poke a hole on that bubble of kind of boosterism. So what I do in the book is basically try to do that. But ultimately, what I argue is that shopping malls are not about shopping, but should be really analyzed in relationship to a larger speculation of space that is taking a pace, the developing world, and Latin America particularly, but the developing world. It's really about the privatization of cities and also the spread of new systems of distinction and social inequalities that are anchored very much in consumption. But I'm going to leave it here because I want to hear from you too. And whatever you guys say, I'll try to respond. And if not, that's fine too.
Rather than talk about the political economy of Latin America, I'm going to add a few comments about my own experiences in Caracas and some observations about what you've done in this book, which I think is really wonderful. So, I do have to say that I did not know what to expect from a book about a topic that really many people have strong opinions about, and yet we know so little. But I found it not only engaging, but really entertaining to read. And that's something, I would say. So for those of you who have seen the recent film, The Big Short, it kind of reminded me of that in a way. It's a film about the housing bubble and the marketing of very obscure mortgage financial packages and really extreme personalities involved in doing that. So in a similar way, I think, I learned about complex financial instruments and dealings in an informative and entertaining way. And also a way that let me into conversations and meetings and training groups where I never would have been able to tread. I learned about how risks are calculated and investment packages are presented in a language that is shared by specialists, one that creates an impression of advanced expertise that is unintelligible to ordinary people, much like the financial market, but which Arlene takes apart by showing how it often becomes its own performative mask. So that was one of the things I really loved, how she says, look, this is really what they're doing. She's also taken really seriously the earlier dictum to study up, and also perhaps a more recent one, to try to connect capital and culture, to explore subjectivities as they are formed within specific spaces and sets of possibilities. She has studied a circuit through which global financial capital, US-dominated industry associations, national economic elites and professionals, national meaning Latin American, urban authorities and agencies, and consumers of mall spaces and goods all intersect in both ordinary and surprising ways. So one of the things I really loved is this is not a story of some necessary globalizing homogenization of space and goods and people. Although that is one of the directions in which the trends that she talks about are moving. Rather, it is an account of globalizing mechanisms and neoliberal practices that take shape within and become materialized through specific urban spaces, national histories, and diverse aspirations and expectations. Much about this analysis has to do with what is hidden, what is concealed, what is invisible. And this may seem strange, given that we are looking at the creation of spaces that are made for the display of goods and the display of people. Spaces where consumers, as Arlene sensitively points out, anxiously prepare their dress and their behavior so as to avoid being found as being out of place or inappropriate. But the financial dealings, the packaging of risk, the elite monopoly of prized land for the location of upscale malls, that's a really central theme, one that touches on a whole issue of existing elite groups that have both finance, name, connections, et cetera, and as well as the top-down form of planning. Planning that really is completely inaccessible to local people, and yet that deeply reshapes neighborhoods and entire cities. These are just a few of the things that go on behind the scenes and that are made invisible. But these dealings are not just decided on in the confines of US companies. As Arlene shows us in scenes of the global industry's inner workings, which are presumably dominated by the standard-setting US industry, mall designers and owners from many Latin American countries have far more cosmopolitan experience and innovative design and activity ideas than do their US counterparts, who are often wedded to the dreary suburban big box idea of a mall. I thought that was a really fascinating dimension. So, having lived in Caracas myself, off and on, over many years, I was surprised when I first lived there to find that there were what they then typically called centros comerciales that were desirable gathering places and located in upscale neighborhoods that displayed prize-winning architectural design. They were often filled with small boutiques rather than department stores. They had tropical foliage, spaces integrated with the outdoors, family gathering spots. All of this changed my notion of what a shopping center was. As Caracas expanded upward in shiny high-rises and office buildings, thanks to the oil boom, the older streets and small stores disappeared. And crowded barrios, often with people who come from rural areas or smaller towns, expanded into the city, kind of breaking down what had been earlier established barriers between neighborhoods and sections of the city. And this was also augmented eventually by the construction of a big subway system. So what became part of some of the malls in the 80s, and a few of them a small section was set off from the central area. Like in one of them that I knew, it was called La Cuadra, the block. And it was made to replicate a village feel or the older Caracas feel. So it had narrow cobblestone paths, little whitewashed small dwellings that housed quaint stores, often with artisanal goods or handmade sweets. The kind of sweets that one no longer found being sold on the streets or were only sold in the now crowded old downtown where middle-class people were afraid at this point to brave the crowds to go. So in these gleaming new malls, one could find a corner with this nostalgic respite in an idealized village or a notion of an earlier Caracas that was in the past clean and safe, where everyone was friendly and polite, and where the well-dressed took their children to show them what the real Caracas was. The growing social tensions and urban deterioration outside were nowhere to be seen. This imaginary of spaces that represent different temporal possibilities is a part of what the malls that Arlene vividly describes are doing. They are part of a process that is remaking the image of what Bogotá claims to be and the aspirations of what some social sectors can become there. For this book deals not in abstractions, but in the concrete location of Bogotá as a site recently marked by civil war and widespread violence. And I must say, at an earlier point when I lived in Caracas, everybody would tell me, don't even dream of going to Bogotá. Now it's unfortunately the reverse. The spatialized social hierarchies of where new malls are located is part of the remaking of the city and of the citizenry. In Caracas, the once expansive boom economy, where at one point those with excess petrodollars barely stopped to shop in the local malls, since they preferred to fly to Miami malls and stock up. They became known as the "Está barato, dame dos" nationality, or the "It's cheap, give me two." That's how they were known in Miami malls. But now, with the economic crisis, with popular class activism under Chavez, or Chavismo rather, and with the oil price declines, Caracas is a city where malls are valued in particular for relative safety and security that they offer in the context of exploding street crime and violence. Nightclubs and movie theaters have relocated to malls as armed guards, parking escorts, and surveillance technology proliferate. Recently, electricity shortages have obliged them to close for certain hours of the day, marking even further the contrast between the unsafe public spaces and the protected space of the mall. Like in Bogotá, the malls in Caracas vary greatly by their location in the city, whether in better or more modest areas, whether close to public transportation or more difficult for working class people to reach. And like there, the self-monitoring of consumers and browsers creates distinct publics. Though many are enclosed, the new mall near our apartment, which is at the intersection of two busy avenues and very different kind of neighborhoods, that new mall has a very futuristic, spectacular design, and it is called El Milenio, the Millennium. It's open air and has a large plaza next to it, but that belongs to it, where breakdancers gather in the evening in this space and where children play in the day. So it gives the impression of being a public space. But Arlene cautions us against the easy celebration of malls as the new public space, noting that they offer a constricted understanding of freedom, one that is centered on leisure and consumption. They contrast with the truly public plaza, where, as in Bogotá's Plaza Bolívar, people have the freedom to gather to make social demands, to create their own forms of sociability, and also to run the risk of repression. Thank you.
So I'm very grateful also to have this occasion to celebrate Arlene's latest book and to join Julie and Arlene and you in thinking about how to read it and how to place that reading in all sorts of considerations, many of which have already been tabled by Arlene and Julie, which concern issues on all our minds about the way the global world is evolving, how class is evolving, how space is evolving, cities are evolving. So I think there are, issues of considerable moment. Sorry, the mic, right? Yeah. Yeah. There's a thing. Please speak into the mic. There we go. So, luckily, all that was dispensable. So, the issues are big issues. That's what I said, and they are issues of wide interest. And like any really first-class anthropologist, Arlene, has a location and has a very fine-grained set of observations, but they're animated by big ideas, big issues, and big debates. And all of them, many of them have been flagged in her comments and also in Julie's comments, for which I'm grateful, so that I don't necessarily need to revisit those and remind you what all is going on in the relationship between what we see in these malls, essentially, and what we don't see, and the relationship between what we see and what we don't see. So I have three very informally developing sets of thoughts, and Arlene said that this was to be a very informal conversation, so I'm still in the process of reading her book. I've looked through it quickly. I had the chance to read some of her earlier thoughts about this subject while she was doing the research, and now it's great to see what shape it's taken. And the three sets of thoughts are like this. The first is to do with what little I know, which is not very much, about the shopping mall syndrome in India, and more particularly in Mumbai, the city in which I grew up, and to which I go quite regularly, at least once or twice a year. A very big city with some of the same issues as, say, Bogotá and Caracas, but also many other cities. The big one being radical inequality and a kind of very chaotic entrance into modern commodity economies, modern democratic politics, modern styles of subjectivity. And Mumbai also has all of these in its own way. And malls have grown, and in my mind, certainly are the malls in Mumbai which have become more elaborate, more differentiated in the sense that they now exist at many, many scales in many, many kinds of neighborhoods, and some of them are very high-end, but the bulk of them are relatively business-like parts of the urban economy for the movement of goods and, in some cases, services. So they're not always or even frequently places for play with very remote or fantastic lifestyle possibilities. They become woven in. The rest of India is another story, and there things are going on which are very new, and where I think there's an even more, if you like, in the Marxist sense, primitive penetration of the agrarian landscape by national and international commercial, architectural, urban, real estate, and financial interests going on at a very, very rapid pace, involving many of the same people who are also doing very raw kinds of primitive exploitation accumulation, as in mining, for example, or exploiting forests, rivers, and so on. Many of the same people are involved in the mall. So actually it's not that differentiated as far as global interests go, and it is very violent. It is very extra legal, and it's very much at the borders of what the law on paper permits or allows. That's the India story, but I'm not, unlike Arlene, I've not looked at that bigger picture closely. I know something about it, but in Mumbai I've seen a bit of this. And the main general conclusion of a comparative type that I draw from my observations in Mumbai and somewhat less in the rest of India is that these malls, varied as they are, as Arlene points out in Bogotá, and Julie also in Caracas, only somewhat about shopping. They're certainly about shopping, but about many, many other things that have to do with the chaotic political economy of kind of transitional or emergent modernities, which vary very much, not just because the cultures vary, but because the ways in which global capital enters and negotiates with local capital, with local governments, with local nation states and so on, all vary. So the variation has many sources. And eventually they take on a kind of cultural stamp, but it's not that culture is the sole driver of difference. So the main takeaway for me from the Indian story that I get from Arlene's book is to be alert to the mode of entry and the role of these kind of spaces in the overall very chaotic transformation of, let's say, capitalist modernity in places like India or Colombia or Venezuela or elsewhere in the world. That's as far as India is concerned. The second reflection that I have is a little less about comparison between, say, Bogotá and other places in Latin America. Excuse me, as you can see, I'm struggling with a little bit of a bug, but or with India or the Middle East or Southeast Asia, although there's a lot I think that could be done there, but more with a slightly more with an abstract question about something also that both Arlene and Julie have flagged, which is what kind of temporality is being produced, enacted, and performed in places like these malls. And I want to say that the first thing is something that I think Julie pointed out, and I think is very important, which is that something here is being performed or being produced performatively, in the sense of performativity first developed by Austin and then developed by Butler and many others, to me the force of which is to see a set of practices and institutions as risky explorations of possibilities and efforts to create realities larger than themselves by rather modest kinds of behavior, language behavior, verbal behavior, clothing behavior, etc., but which carry a performative aspiration. And that those performative aspirations, especially from the point of view of the middle class, can be very ambiguous. They can be liberatory, emancipatory, etc., but they can also be disciplinary, repressive, exclusive, and so on. But in any case, they can be seen as having a performative dimension or being crucially performative in the sense that they aspire to create a state of affairs by enacting something which is not yet in place. And the outcomes can be very variable. So they're not classic performatives that rely on felicity and therefore simply work. They are performatives that are risky, incomplete, uncertain, volatile, and so on. So when I think of the middle class, I think you might say that spaces like the mall are performative in the sense that they also are about performative efforts to experiment with the idea that there is a middle class, that there are middle class people actually here, upper middle class or middle class, whatever. So it's not referring to a stable reality that's been in place forever and ever. It's an effort to perform that possibility. So I think if you look at Arlene's study as a window into, let's call it the emerging middle classes in a globalized world, I would say it's a window that shows you how certain spaces and certain practices of consumption, of shopping and so on, are efforts to explore whether there's a middle class really here. If so, who's in it? Am I in it? Are you in it? Are we in it? Is this place it? It's not about certainties. It's about explorations. And that is the performative quality. And that leads me to my third set of considerations, which is also a bit general. And that is if you take the key elements of Arlene's story, which are shopping, commodities, urban space, urban planning, speculation, risky investment, both by locals and globals and people at every level in between, class, consumption, production, big matters that have been subjects of historical and sociological and anthropological exploration for a very long time. What I see here is something that first began to occur to me in a very unlikely place, which is on my one visit to China, when I went to Beijing and to Shanghai, maybe 10 years ago. And it was in the context of some conference about housing and cities and so on. And it suddenly occurred to me that when I looked at this Beijing landscape, which made New York look virtually rural, because it was packed with these cranes, new buildings going up everywhere. The story is much more advanced now, and that was going on all over China, but I saw it in Beijing. It suddenly flashed on me that in an older urban sociology or history, we used to think of cities as being there and housing as a need that arose from cities. Suddenly I realized, no, here we have housing, which then requires cities to be built around it. So we have actually developers and speculators who simply say, okay, I can get this footprint, I'll build a unit with 500 condos. Somebody will come from Hong Kong, Shanghai, Beijing, they'll be in it. If they're in it, they'll need services, they'll need servants, then people will come, then there will be jobs. Hello? This is not cities needing the housing. This is housing demanding cities. And this is a Chinese story. And suddenly I realized this is a story also in India and places like that, where developers are going into rural places. Are there cities there? No. But they will create these condo-type universes, 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, 4 bedrooms, 5 bedrooms, particularly for overseas people, but also for wealthy Indians. And the idea is the city will follow. I now, reading Arlene's book, I want to push this point further and say that the kind of vertigo that is produced when you really read Arlene's book closely is not the vertigo of the detail. It's actually the sequences are all out of order. In other words, you don't have a history of cities in which there's employment, and then the employment seeks commodities, the commodities create classes, the classes have disposable income, they need to shop, so they say, where are the malls? Somebody says, okay, you need malls? No! If somebody says, this place is good for a mall, who's going to come to the mall? Well, let's attract certain people, and then we'll figure out if they are middle class enough. Let's produce the debt that they can exercise in order to be in the mall and shop, and then out of that, we will then retrofit a class that could afford to repay the debt. Oh my God. And then maybe at the end of it, we will have some kind of urban formation, etc. Or some kind of class formation which is regular, comprehensible, and makes sense. This is all totally out of whack. And nor is it, unfortunately, that you can tell a story where A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D, leads to E, at the end of which, let's say, you have very, let's see, high-end consumption by a very small number of people, which then informs a more complex economy. You don't have that sequence simply run in reverse. It's simply irregular. So you can enter this kind of world through debt, for example, and say, okay, let's have lots of debt and credit, shopping based on that. You can enter through that and then suddenly start producing spaces where that happens, etc. Or you can cut in through fashion. Well, let's have a show. Let's have these things, and then work into the mall. Or you can start with a condo complex, real estate. So let's just build it for people in Bogotá or in Colombia or elsewhere, or a place like Miami is even more clear in this. Build it and they will come. Classes will come, cities will come, etc. So the sequence is all out of whack. So that's my last and final comment, that reading this book alerts me to the fact that all the sequences we thought were relatively secure, in terms of which we could tell the story of the global journey of capital and so on, are up in the air because they are being rewired, rejigged, and resequenced in places like Bogotá.
Yeah. Wow, thank you. Thank you. To me, it's fascinating because last week we had a discussion at McNally Jackson with Craig Stephen Wilder, the historian, and some of you were there, and you may remember how different the discussion was. We spent the whole hour talking about class, interclass, and race dynamics in the mall. And we never got to the financial stuff or the urban planning stuff, right? And today is the other country, so I'm delighted because I've been meaning to talk also about the issues that you brought up, because to me that was kind of like the biggest, like, wow, aha discovery. The fact that shopping malls are not buildings but are financial mechanisms, and that I needed to understand them as financial mechanisms, as speculative devices. I mean, I never even took economics 101. I mean, what do I know? I can even balance my checkbook. And here I am trying to understand the ways in which these developers and investors were talking about shopping malls, the ways that shopping malls are real estate investment trusts, right? I think one of the pictures points, akin to how akin to how prisons and hospitals and other types of real estate are, so that when you're investing, actually many middle classes now, especially in places like Mexico and Chile, that have developed REIT-type mechanisms for investments, all of those working classes, their pensions are being invested in shopping malls, unbeknownst to them. So there's that, what you're talking about. They become this huge speculative instrument. So yeah, to me, it was like a big learning device. And what you have is places like Chile and Mexico already developing REIT-type instruments where the shopping mall is owned as part of a portfolio and you have global interests. But then Colombia was not that. Colombia had a very different model of ownership of shopping malls. And that was, to me, was so exciting, is to see that kind of models. It was kind of basically the struggle for land and the struggle for real estate. Because one of the earliest shopping mall in Bogotá, Unicentro, was owned by 526 different owners. Because that's how malls were. And actually, this is the pattern in India, also in other developing worlds, because before you had finance and before you have ability to finance through global, but you're going to build a mall, you build it as a condominium, right? People chip in, but they own their stores and they own and that's how Unicentro was owned by 500 different people. But then what happens with Zara and these global brands want to come into Colombia, right? It's not easy, it's not expedient, it's not efficient to have to negotiate with 10 different owners to actually have the kind of real estate that you need to actually have that store. So there was an incredible struggle over land that had to do with different models, and the globalization of retail was about how to open up Colombia and all of these developing markets for global entry, for the entry of brands and the globalization of retail. So to me, it was fascinating to get into that demand. Very quickly, I'm glad you brought up the architecture of Venezuela, because it was fascinating that Venezuela was touted as an example of the kind of pride that Latin American developers had around their designs, right? And a lot of the I forget the name of the Sambil. All of the Sambil developments are like touted as at the pinnacle of, and I had to understand that you know, in contrast to the big box, the Latin American designers, you know, had the kind of Latin American nationalist ideology 101 that goes back to Nos Rodó. You know, the fact that we Latin Americans are more inventive, more cultural, more artistic, and we're not going to be bogged down by, you know, by all these kind of boring designs. But that was also the same kind of nationalism, cultural nationalism, that a lot of the Anglo investors were exploiting to say that, well, Latin Americans may be inventive, but they're so floppy, these designs don't have the technical, right? The technical, they're going to fall apart, right? And there was it was fascinating to kind of see those contests of values around Latin Americans being more artistic, but less technically efficient. Right, and then all these North American people that that were coming and crowding the developers, selling that, saying that, you know, you want to hire me because I know how to build your mall, because I have the expertise. It was fascinating to see those contests. So I'm glad you brought that too, and also the issue of how do we theorize public space, right, as a space where you can make demands. Right, because these are shopping malls. There's not, I mean, a demonstration that these kids organized was very rare, but it also was a very performative, right? It was middle class kids, you know, it was kind of like, you know, drums, and it was, you know, there's a performative aspect to how a lot of demonstrations in shopping malls in Latin America take place, because there's limits. It's not the kind of demonstration that you're gonna find in Plaza de Mayo, Plaza de Bolivar, right? There are limits to what you can do in a mall. You can't sell arepas inside a mall, right, without a permit. You can do that in the street, in a plaza. So there's a lot of elements for how to think about public space that kind of bring ideas of what are the rights, what can people do that highlight both the right to make demands and political demands, but also the right to make a living. Right? And all of this is happening in a moment where you have incredible attacks against the informal economy. And anybody who knows anything about Latin America knows that the stronghold of the middle class in Latin America has historically been this kind of economies, right? This is how people make a living. This is how has sustained the middle classes for generations, yet are not able to compete with the prices of like all of this, you know, Forever 21s coming up. Thank you, Oriana. She's the one who took me and introduced me, and we made beautiful leather jackets. Thank you. And then to Arjun, so thank you for that. And then to Arjun, yeah, radical poverty. I'm glad that you brought up the illegality, the issue of illicit activities, because it's well known that, of course, the construction, a lot of these shopping malls are sites of money laundering and the drug traffic. Right, the relationship between the construction and the illicit drug trade in Colombia, but also throughout Latin America, is huge, and it's something that I felt like I couldn't capture. But you know, there's a chapter where one of the most memorable activities to do this book is I attended a course at the University of Shopping Malls in Mexico. And the University of Shopping Malls is organized by the International Council of Shopping Malls that has this kind of traveling kind of forums. And I went to Mexico and I sat in a classroom with developers from like Argentina, Chile, whatever, and they were all talking about malls. And to me it was fascinating because the issue of the mordidas and the illicit permits came up. And it was obvious that everybody was on the joke that this is what you do. But then of course you had the ICS director leading the class who of course was like this, you know, like I don't know anything about anything, like you know, like it's not true. If you remember the big expose on Walmart by the New York Times, you know, that basically Walmart was found to have purchased permits, and it was, you know, it went all the way back. The reporters traced the cover-up all the way back to the offices of Walmart in the United States. So it's not like this doesn't happen in the United States. The United States is entirely complicit. In fact, one of the reasons why a lot of these developers are going to Latin America is because, as somebody told me, in Latin America, is not what you know, is who you know. Right? The idea that if you get the right contact, you really don't have to worry about much, right? That there's this kind of like assumption that you're gonna be paying locals to take care of all the kind of, you know, illegality that you may not have to wash your hands and you can wash your hands off. So there's a lot of that. And then in terms of the middle classes and the performative, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's really an incredible contest. And I have to say that India, to me, was fascinating as a comparison, because I just learned by interviewing the Mexican that most of the theaters in shopping malls are actually owned by Cinemapolis, who is a Mexican entrepreneur. And it's fascinating how you have the connections between, Mexico and India through shopping malls, And it's because basically they're organizing the theaters there along the idea of luxury and the idea that, certain classes will buy a little bit extra to distinguish themselves, and that kind of anchoring of prestige and luxury that becomes, so prevalent to all this discussion. But we wanted to include a couple questions before we finished, so that hear from the audience. You've been so patient. Why don't we get maybe 3 or 4, and then we'll respond, and then we'll just go and eat wine and cheese, which is what I've been meaning to do all afternoon.
Thank you. Is this on? I don't know if this is a question or an observation, and it's unfortunately based on the fact that I haven't read the book yet. My copy, UPS told me, doesn't come till tomorrow, so I regret that. And it's about something, Arjun at one point used the word growing. Shopping malls are a growing phenomenon in Latin America. Many of your images were about things like malls as asset. And I guess I wanted to ask about what seems to be happening differently in the U.S. sector. If you read the Wall Street Journal, it's constantly about the failure of the mall as a financial
Absolutely.
model. Just today there was an article in the Wall Street Journal about malls being sold off. Someone said, someone from the real estate industry saying 15% of all malls should be closed down between today and tomorrow. And with the irony that precisely the kind of public space that you say isn't being used by malls, namely hospitals, education sites, that's what a lot of malls in the U.S. are being converted to. So community colleges are buying up mall space like crazy. So
Correct.
Is it a
Absolutely.
different phenomenon, or will the Latin American mall unfortunately catch up to the U.S. mall?
Absolutely. Why don't we get a couple more, and because that's a big one.
Yeah,
Hi, Radha.
Hi, congratulations, Arlene. It just sounds like a fascinating book. I'm sorry I haven't read it. I was really struck by the comments that malls are mechanisms, not spaces. As Arjun said, they are experiments with the possible.
Absolutely.
And I do need to also get back to the India story, because I'm curious about the material spaces. And as Dana said, it's kind of interesting. The opposite in India, in Mumbai, for example, the dyeing textile factories are now malls. In Chennai, a defunct newspaper house
Absolutely.
is an upscale mall. So I was really curious about, and with names like Millennium and Phoenix and Liberty and stuff. So I'm just
And
curious
Titan,
where.
this one that you saw, this is called Titan.
Yeah, where
the
are
same
these
idea.
malls built? I'm curious if you could tell us
Absolutely.
about it.
Absolutely. One more?
Yes, one more. Hi. Congratulations,
Sonia. ¿Cómo
Arlene. It's
estás?
great. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the adventures of doing ethnography in this kind of field or space, and
It's terrible.
what
So
did it
terrible.
mean, and how long did you take, and a little bit more of the insider story as a researcher.
Absolutely. Well, the story of ghost malls, of course, everybody knows that that malls in the United States are dead, and that's exactly what's fueling the globalization of the industry. So in all of the industry meetings that I went in Las Vegas and New York City, where they meet, that's exactly what's leading this impetus for the global as the new space for growth, right? Now, a lot of these developers know that is going to cut up with them, right? Because you have internet, you have all kinds of other things that are, however, there's going to be a temporality there, right? For instance, internet, you can shop in the internet, but you don't have the infrastructure for delivery. So in Colombia, it's going to be like 10 years at least. Like, people put these projections and imagine how long it would be for these malls to be profitable. And the fact is that not only are they profitable in terms of the mall, but one of the arguments I make, that this is all about speculation with high real estate and planning. because that's exactly what's happening. These malls are not being built in, you know, en el fandunguito del carajo. I'm sorry for the expression. You know, they're developed like in the middle, you know, like in prime real estate, or in prime areas of growth, or in areas that are being planned for gentrification. Like, for instance, the Occidente region, which, you know, in Colombia, Bogotá, for instance, used to be Norte y el Sur, and that's it, North and South, and that's it. Now you have Occidente, right, as this middle-class area of growth just because of 2 shopping malls opened in that area and transformed, and, you know, you had housing and you had the whole kind of development. So they're becoming real, to Rada's question, they're becoming urban engines of gentrification and reevaluation of land. And transforming and remaking. And the fastest growth in shopping malls are in intermediary cities, because a lot of the cities are now saturated, but they're going to intermediary cities where they're doing that. They're going, again, to cities, right? So, but yeah, it's the whole realization that the ghost malls here, and then of course, it speaks to the kind of, what Julie was saying too, in terms of this evolutionary idea that you know, that the United States is the pinnacle, and that we need to learn from the United States, and that's why a lot of the University of Shopping Malls was about that. It's like, we're here to teach you, and the people were like, what do you have to teach us, or your malls are dead, you know? But then there was this idea that, well, you know, unless you learn from our stories, you may repeat it. And, you know, it's already, in Brazil, you have cases of ghost malls already. Mexico, there's an incredible real estate bubble right now, and so the ghost malls as a phenomenon in Latin America, we're going to be seeing them not 10, 15 years, as some of my informants argued. I believe we're going to see them much sooner than that. But yeah, the fascinating aspect of where these malls are is that they're becoming, I use the word of Liliana de Simone, which is an urban planner in Chile. Chile, as you know, is kind of ahead of all this development because it's an experiment of neoliberalism in the Americas. So you have the development of malls. In fact, a lot of the malls in Chile, in Colombia, in Peru are actually Chilean developers that are becoming spearheaders of the model of shopping malls. And they, oh my God, I lost my train of thought. Chileans. The malls, yeah. Oh, no, Liliana de Simone, the retail urbanism. The idea that the malls are becoming kind of the spearheaders of a new urbanism. And this is really key, because in Latin America, Mexico has perhaps the strongest tradition of urban planning, but Colombia, for instance, developed its first Plan Territorial, de Organización Territorial in the 2000. You know, we're talking about kind of late. So these are countries, and that's another issue where they're so ripe for developers, because you don't have all of these kinds of, you know, like planning boards or zoning legislations. It's easier. You don't have the stronger tradition. Not that developers don't ignore all those things here and then pay per permits or whatever, but at least you have some kind of premise of, right, accountability for community or planning organization. You don't have that in Latin America as strong, and you have an incredible decentralized planning structure where developers can plan with communities, with cities, with residencies, right? And that facilitates incredible dealings at the level that then when you look at the larger planning, you've created chaos. So that's what happened in Bogotá. Like that Titan thing, you know, it's a huge infrastructural take. And what happens with the traffic, the implications around traffic, pollution, the organization of the city, none of that has been taken into account. The last administration, when I was doing my research, was more left and wanted to control and developed a new plan to control shopping malls for the first time and actually asked for money. And actually he created an incredible political brouhaha. And actually he was ultimately defeated, and the plan, I think, it's now defeated because now we have Peñalosa, which is the neoliberal. You know, he wants to just paint everybody, and you know, he's kind of the architect.
What was the name of this man? Was this the guy who came here to NYU? And
that was Antonio Marcos. Yeah,
that's
Marcos.
somebody else. Yeah.
But he was also the Bogotá. Under him, you have he actually went and baptized the first Salitre Plaza, and you know he's famous. And that's another thing, because you know we celebrated Antonio Marcos. We're like, please teach us how to be urban. And I'm like, hey, he's the one who opened up all the shopping malls in Bogotá. How about that? You know, how about the implications of the privatization of space? Let's talk about that, right? So absolutely. And then there was a last question that the urban planning.
About your methods and ethnography.
Oh, Oh, I love studying up. Nobody studies up. You know what I mean? I think as a Puerto Rican, I have a commitment to study people in power and to expose white crime and, and like corporate America. We need to do that. And so that's my commitment has always been. And I felt like, in this case, it was kind of, and we tend to think that people in power are inaccessible because they kind of are, they protect themselves, but they also have things like trade organizations and meetings and conferences where they meet and they talk. All you have to do is crash them. To me, it was incredibly important to learn about the International Council of Shopping Malls. They're in Rockefeller Center, and they have a huge organization. And for $50, you could become a member. I became a member for $50, and then I went to their meetings, and I, of course, said, I'm a student, I'm a teacher, and I crashed all those events for $50 membership. And of course, I got a grant. Thank goodness, Wendy Grant Foundation gave me a grant that allowed me to travel. But everybody else was paying thousands of dollars to attend those conferences, and I was able to participate as a student, And of course, I had the support of Jorge Lizan, who was then the director of the shopping mall. And I have no idea. He's like, you have to write this book. And I'm like, but do you understand that I'm an anthropologist? Have you read the stuff I write? I criticize what you guys do. And he kind of, I always find that people in power, they're so powerful, they don't care if you criticize them. You're irrelevant to their criticisms, So he kind of like helped me. He's like, well, come, I'll invite you to speak in Medellin. And, he's the one that invited me and then gave me the access. And I'm like, oh my God, and introduced me to people and said, talk to her. So sometimes all you need is like one person that believes in you or just, gives you a door, and you just try to charm your way to the rest of the, But it's the one thing is that this book is fascinating to me to write because I had that kind of people of power spaces going to those conferences, University of Shopping Malls. But I knew that if I wanted to get to the texture of what these shopping malls mean to local people on the ground, I had to do a more ethnographically close. So I spent time in Bogotá, Colombia. I decided Bogotá because everybody was raving about Bogotá because of the transfer, the changing of land politics. It was a good case study. And you had the whole new brands, and you had the Tratado Libre Comercio that was opening up. So it was there was a lot of things happening in Colombia that made it a good case study. So I spend my summers there, which is winter, and I visited as many times as I could, and I did interviews. I had incredible people that helped me, so I don't know if this answers your question, but I do think that we should never be scared that, oh my God, I can never write about shopping malls in Latin America, such a big topic. Like, no, there's always a way. Or Hispanic market in the United States, so big. No, all you have to do is, all these industries like have entryways. The question is, how do you break? And I'm not pretending to know everything about the industry. But I think what I provided will answer a lot of questions to people who want to know about that industry, which is all we want, right? One more? I told Gwyneth that.
Do you want to take one more?
Yeah. Is it the hour?
We are at the time that you wanted to stop.
Okay. Yeah. So we'll do 5 more minutes because we still have the time until 8 o'clock. I wanted always more reception and wine and cheese than Q&As. But Bill Santiago, who is a very important Puerto Rican comedian.
How much shopping did you do during your research? And what was the best shopping deal that you found and took advantage of?
That is a very important question. Well, I think it's important to realize that, retail workers are not going to talk to you if you're going to waste your time. They want to sell, and it's their job. And they're there, I couldn't expect to talk to retail workers, and just go, hi, talk to me, and, I needed to be a consumer. So what I did is I developed relationships. Once you buy something from a store, they're going to be friends with you forever. So I felt that once I bought one thing, they let me, I was, because there's a lot of, hola, ¿cómo estás? Ta, 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 that kind of culture. So I did a lot of that with, there were like 2 or 3 stores that I knew, and that allowed me to observe, because what I wanted was also to observe interactions, right? Shoppers and how people shopped, and I needed to have the in, right? So I shop purposively for a reason, And I also try to do a lot of independent design. You notice here that there's a big move here for independent design and for locals. You know, I discovered, and actually a lot of Colombians didn't know, I took pride in teaching them about the one, because there's a lot of like, you know, it's like in Puerto, everything that comes from the United States is better, right? So I felt like part of what I was also doing was kind of like rescuing, and I discovered this, you know, Laura de Dios, who this is incredible, beautiful artisanal, you know, and I would wear it to my middle class informants, and they would ask me, what is that? Oh, that's loud, and you know, to me it was like, you know, it was, I don't know, I was like a little terrorist, you know, kind of highlighting, you know, the aesthetics and the designs and the artists that sometimes are not evaluated. When I got my jacket, like any middle class will never go to that market, right? ¿Cómo es que se llama no el market? I forget el San Victorino. If you're middle class, you will never cut that because it's like the most terrible thing you could ever do, right? I loved flashing my San Victorino outfits for my upper middle class informants, you know? Because it was kind of like, you know, I don't know, it was kind of a, you know, fashion terrorism 101. But this idea of, you know, and I talk about in my previous book, Cultural Works, that made this argument about how can we support local artists and local designers and give a voice. And one of the things that I wanted to do was give a voice to local designers and local artists vis-a-vis the incredible gentrification of retail, the incredible globalization of retail, and also fashion elites that were highlighting, oh, now tenemos fashion ahora porque tenemos Zara, right? It's incredible Eurocentrism that was really running around the whole globalization of retail, right? That's also something that I wanted to highlight. So absolutely, I shopped Colombiano. Siempre que anything I shop, I made sure that it was Colombiano, and it was kind of part of the discussion that allowed me to generate around, you know, what was better, what was worse, what was, you know, quality, and what does it mean when everybody is like people are dying to buy Forever 21, you know, because that becomes a sign of style, and that's not what you wanted to know. You're such a provocateur. Anyways, we can talk about shopping malls for hours, but before I end, I wanted just to give Julie and Arjun, you know, my deepest thanks, because they've made the book far more interesting than at this point I'm able to speak about. It's really. And so I really want to thank them, because I admire their work, and I actually told them, just talk about shopping malls in Caracas and India, you know? So thank you for doing that. My heartfelt gratitude. And the rest of you, please have wine and cheese and hang out. Thank you.